Faith sat on the edge of the bed, her swollen belly a constant reminder of how much her life had changed over the past year. She was 9 months pregnant, but instead of the joy and excitement that should accompany such a time, all she felt was a dull ache in her chest, a void where her marriage to Mason used to be. Mason had always been a bit distant, but during her pregnancy, his emotional absence had become unbearable. He had grown colder, more dismissive, retreating into the comfortable routine of visiting his parents every weekend. As if nothing had changed, as if he wasn't about to become a father. Faith felt more like a burden than a partner. She had tried to talk to him about it countless times, hoping he would show some concern, some sign that he cared about her and their unborn child, but every attempt had been met with indifference. Now, sitting alone in their small San Francisco apartment, Faith wiped away a tear. Mason was, once again, at his parents' house for the weekend. He didn't even ask if she was okay before leaving, didn't offer to help her with the laundry or dishes. The loneliness was suffocating, and despite her efforts to find solace in her photography, the weight of her emotions was too heavy to carry. It wasn't just the household responsibilities that she had to shoulder, it was the emotional labor of keeping up appearances, pretending everything was fine when, deep down, she knew their marriage was falling apart. Faith could no longer deny the growing resentment she felt toward Mason, but she wasn't ready to face the full extent of it just yet. Late that night, as she lay in bed alone, the baby kicked gently. She smiled briefly, grateful for this little life growing inside her. But the joy was short-lived, replaced by a sinking feeling as her mind wandered back to Mason's harsh words from earlier in the week. "You're being dramatic, Faith. Just because you're pregnant doesn't mean you're sick," he had said after she'd asked him to help with the groceries. She'd swallowed her frustration then, not wanting to start yet another argument. But the hurt lingered, deepening the emotional distance between them. As she drifted into a restless sleep, a thought echoed in her mind: how had it come to this? The day Mason would irreversibly shatter Faith's trust began like any other. The morning was cloudy, the air thick with the promise of rain, and Mason was agitated. They were supposed to be heading out for a family trip with his parents, a trip Faith had been dreading for weeks. She didn't feel comfortable traveling so close to her due date, but Mason had insisted, brushing aside her concerns with his usual disregard. "Stop being so paranoid, Faith. You'll be fine," he snapped as he loaded the last of the bags into the car. But Faith wasn't fine. As they made their way out of the city, a sudden sharp pain gripped her lower abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly. Mason stopped the car. "Something's wrong," she cried, her heart racing in panic. Mason sighed in exasperation. "Faith, not now. We're going to be late." "I think my water just broke," she exclaimed, her voice shaking with fear. She could feel the wetness spreading beneath her. Mason pulled the car over, but instead of helping her, instead of showing the concern she so desperately needed, he glared at her with a mixture of anger and disgust. "Are you serious? You're going to ruin the car," he shouted, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Without another word, he got out of the car, walked around to her side, and yanked the door open. "Get out," he demanded. Faith stared at him, stunned. "What? Mason, I need to go to the hospital." "Then book a helicopter or something. I'm not dealing with this right now," he barked, his voice cold and devoid of any empathy. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was this the man she had married? The man who was supposed to protect and care for her? Tears filled her eyes as she struggled to stand. Her legs trembled, and she clutched her belly, feeling a deep sense of betrayal. She could barely process what was happening, but instinct took over. She needed to get help, and fast. As Mason sped off down the road without a backward glance, Faith collapsed onto the sidewalk, unable to hold back her sobs. Just then, a familiar voice called out from behind her. "Faith, oh my God, are you okay?" Amber, their neighbor from across the street, ran over, her eyes wide with concern. Amber had always been kind, a steady presence in Faith's otherwise chaotic life. She lived with her teenage son Brett, and had been nothing but supportive since they'd met. I need to get to the hospital," Faith choked out. Amber didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Don't worry, Faith. I'm here. Help is on the way." As they waited for the ambulance, Amber stayed by her side, holding her hand, comforting her. In that moment, Faith knew she would never forget Amber's kindness. She was a lifeline in the darkest hour. Faith's labor was long and grueling, but Amber never left her side. It wasn't until she was cradling her newborn son in her arms that she realized the full gravity of what had happened earlier that day. Mason hadn't even called to check on her. He had completely abandoned her in her time of need. The following morning, as Faith lay in a hospital bed, exhausted but overjoyed by the sight of her sleeping baby, Amber came into the room holding her phone, her face pale. "Faith, there's something you need to see," Amber said hesitantly, handing her the phone. A video was playing. Faith's heart dropped as she saw herself on the screen, standing by the side of the road, sobbing and pleading with Mason to take her to the hospital. The camera angle was shaky, likely from someone recording through a car window. The footage showed Mason's angry face as he kicked her out of the car, leaving her alone on the sidewalk. The video cut to Amber rushing over to help. "Oh my God," Faith whispered. Who filmed this?" Amber shook her head. "I don't know, but it's everywhere now. It's gone viral." Faith stared at the screen in disbelief. The video had millions of views, and the comments were filled with outraged people condemning Mason's behavior, calling for him to face consequences. Her shock quickly turned to relief. The world had seen the truth of Mason's cruelty. He couldn't hide from this. So it wasn't long before the repercussions hit. Mason lost his job at the prestigious firm where he worked as an architect. His reputation was in tatters, and no amount of pleading or explaining could undo the damage. Faith learned from Amber that his parents were also facing public backlash for their involvement in supporting Mason's behavior. Faith didn't feel vindictive, but there was a small sense of justice in seeing Mason finally face the consequences of his action. It wasn't about revenge, it was about recognizing her worth and knowing she deserved better. Once Faith was discharged from the hospital, she moved in with her parents. They lived in the same San Francisco neighborhood where she had grown up, and though they were elderly, they welcomed her and the baby with open arms. Her parents' home became a sanctuary, a place where she could heal and figure out the next steps for her and her son. The pain of Mason's betrayal lingered, but Faith was determined to rebuild her life. Amber and Brett were frequent visitors, offering companionship and support whenever they could. Faith found herself drawn to Brett, who was in his late 20s. He had always been kind and thoughtful, helping her with groceries or offering to watch the baby so she could get some rest. Their friendship deepened over the following months, and Faith began to see Brett in a new light. But just as their bond grew stronger, Mason re-entered the picture, desperate to regain control over his life and over Faith. He showed up unexpectedly at her parents' house one afternoon, disheveled and pleading for a second chance. Faith hadn't seen Mason in months, and the sight of him standing on her parents' front porch sent a jolt of fear through her. He looked haggard, his once meticulously groomed appearance now marred by disheveled hair and dark circles under his eyes. His fall from grace had clearly taken its toll. "Faith, please, just hear me out," Mason said, his voice shaky. He glanced nervously at the house, clearly aware of how unwelcome he was. "I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I was stressed and I didn't know how to handle everything. You have to understand, I never meant to hurt you." Faith's grip on the door tightened. She could feel her pulse quickening, but she forced herself to remain calm. There was a time when his apologies might have worked, when his smooth talking and manipulative charm would have made her doubt her own instinct. But not anymore. "Mason, you left me on the side of the road when I was in labor," Faith said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I could have died. Our son could have died. How can you think that's something I can forgive?" Mason's face twisted with frustration. "I know it was wrong, but everything was falling apart, and I panicked. My job, my reputation, it's all gone. I lost everything because of that video." Faith clenched her jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You lost everything because of what you did, Mason. The video only showed people the truth." Mason's desperation shifted to anger. "You don't get it, do you? You and that nosy neighbor of yours destroyed my life. My career, my future, everything's ruined. Do you even know what I've been through?" Faith couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "What you've been through? What about me, Mason? I had to give birth without my husband. I had to raise our child without any support from you. And now you show up here like you're the victim." Mason took a step forward, his eyes hardening. "We're still married, Faith. You can't just cut me out like this. I'm his father and I have rights." Faith felt a wave of nausea at his words, but before she could respond, her father appeared in the doorway. His stern expression left no room for doubt. "I think it's time for you to leave, Mason," he said firmly. "Faith doesn't owe you anything. You had your chance, and you threw it away." Mason glared at her father, but he didn't argue. With one last look at Faith, he turned and stormed down the porch steps, muttering under his breath. As he disappeared down the street, Faith felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. She knew this wasn't over. Later that night, Faith sat with Amber, recounting the confrontation. Amber listened quietly, her eyes filled with concern. "He's not going to give up easily," Amber warned. "Men like Mason never do." Faith nodded, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't want Mason anywhere near her son, but she knew he could make things difficult. The divorce proceedings had been slow, and though the public outrage had worked in her favor, Mason's threats of claiming his parental rights had left her uneasy. As the night wore on, Faith realized she couldn't keep living in fear. She had fought too hard to rebuild her life, and she wasn't going to let Mason tear it apart again. In the weeks that followed, Faith threw herself into her photography, using it as both an escape and a source of healing. She had always loved capturing moments of joy, love, and truth, but now, her work took on a deeper meaning. It became her way of reclaiming her identity, of moving forward. Her bond with Brett also deepened, evolving from friendship into something more. Brett was gentle, patient, and kind, the complete opposite of Mason. He had a quiet strength that made Faith feel safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, while taking photos by the bay, Faith found herself opening up to Brett about her fears. "I'm scared Mason's going to try to take my son," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Brett's expression softened and he reached out, taking her hand. "Faith, you're not alone in this. We'll fight him together. He doesn't get to hurt you anymore." Faith looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. For so long she had carried the burden of her marriage's collapse, the betrayal, and the fear. But here with Brett, she realized she didn't have to carry it alone. Over time, their relationship blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Brett had been there during the darkest moments of her life, and as they spent more time together, Faith began to see a future with him, one filled with love, stability, and hope. Yet part of her hesitated. After everything she had been through, she wasn't sure if she was ready to love again. So one evening, as they sat together on the porch of her parents' house, watching the sun set over the city, Brett turned to her with a serious expression. "Faith, I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But I need to know if you see a future with me. I don't want to push you, but I also don't want to be caught in something that's just temporary." Faith's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to bring it up so directly, but she appreciated his honesty. She had been asking herself the same question: could she really open her heart to someone again after what Mason had done? "I do care about you, Brett," she said slowly, "but I've been through so much and I'm scared of getting hurt again." Brett nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I get that, but I'm not Mason, Faith. I'm not going to hurt you, and I'll be here however long it takes for you to trust that." Faith's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of being seen and understood. She leaned into Brett, resting her head on his shoulder as they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky darken. Maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again. As the months passed, Faith's divorce from Mason finally moved forward. With public opinion still firmly against him and his job prospects dwindling, Mason reluctantly agreed to the terms of the divorce, including child support. But his bitterness hadn't faded, and Faith knew he wouldn't let things go quietly. One afternoon, she received a call from her lawyer. Mason was petitioning for partial custody of their son. The news hit Faith like a punch to the gut. She couldn't imagine allowing Mason to be a part of her child's life after what he had done, but the law didn't always work in black and white. Faith knew she would have to fight him, and the thought terrified her. Amber and Brett rallied around her, offering support and guidance as she prepared for the custody battle. Brett's quiet confidence helped steady her nerves, and Amber's practical advice gave her the strength to stand up to Mason once and for all. The courtroom was a sterile, intimidating place, but Faith walked in with her head held high. Mason sat at the other table, looking far more polished than the last time she had seen him, but his cold eyes hadn't changed. The legal arguments were fierce, with Mason's lawyer painting him as a man who had made a mistake but deserved a second chance at fatherhood. Faith's lawyer countered with the video, the abandonment, and the emotional harm Mason had caused. In the end, the judge ruled in Faith's favor, granting her full custody and limiting Mason's visitation to supervised visits. It wasn't a perfect victory. Mason would still have some access to their son, but it was enough. She had won the most important battle of her life. As she left the courthouse, her heart still pounding with adrenaline, Faith felt a sense of relief wash over her. Mason would no longer have control over her or their son. She was free. 6 months later, Faith stood in the backyard of her parents' house, watching her son toddle across the grass, giggling as he chased a butterfly. The sun was warm in her skin, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. It was a perfect afternoon, one that seemed almost too peaceful, given the turmoil she had faced not so long ago. Brett stood beside her, smiling as he watched the little boy play. He slipped his hand into hers, and Faith felt a wave of contentment wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. Her photography business was thriving, her son was healthy and happy, and she had found a love that was genuine and true. The scars from her past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. She had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, and she had emerged stronger than she ever thought possible. As she looked at Brett, who had been there for her through it all, she knew that she had found something rare and precious: trust, love, and a future worth fighting for. With a deep breath, Faith turned to him and smiled. "Let's make this a real beginning," she said softly. Brett smiled back, squeezing her hand. "I thought you'd never ask." And as the sun set over the horizon, casting the world in a golden glow, Faith knew that this was the start of a new, brighter chapter, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of happiness. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.